My question is, how exactly did the Hasmoneans regain Jewish sovereignty over Judea against the Seleucid Empire? Seleucid Empire was not a small empire. Okay, it wasn't the whole, it was one quarter basically, and it was a big quarter of Alexander's empire, and they had a large army. It appears that what happened was something like this. Remember, this is a 3-year revolt against the Seleucid Empire. It's a 3-year guerrilla warfare. And their battles, some of them they win, some of them they lose, but mostly they win. The problem was, after 3 years of uprisings, the Seleucids started fighting the Persians. And they didn't really have time to waste time on the Jews in Judea. So the question was, how are we going to get this uprising finished? So there are 2 ways to stop an uprising. Number one is you can squash it if you have the time and the funding and the soldiers. Another way to do it is negotiation. So they decided to negotiate a deal with Judah. And the deal was, Judah can run a sovereignty in Judea. He had the right name, of course. So Judah can negotiate a sovereignty in Judea. The only difference would be, it would be a vassal state, which means it has sovereignty, but under the Seleucid Empire. So, of course, they would have to, pay allegiance to the Seleucid Empire. They would have to maybe pay a certain amount of money to the Seleucid Empire, but they did have sovereignties, and the Seleucid Empire was not supposed to tell them who the king was supposed to be. So this deal went out very well, and from the point of view of Hanukkah, it's a victory. Probably from the point of view of the Seleucids, it's a solution to a big pain in the butt, as we say. But they really didn't have the manpower at the time to deal with it, because they were fighting the Persians, and that's really where they had to put their time. So certain things happen in history because they happen at the right time. And that seems to be the story of the battle with Judah. So, they battled very bravely, but would they have actually won if there was not another front from the Persian Empire? It's not clear. But we believe in divine providence, so we believe that God controls history in very unusual ways. And, that's the way things happen. I want to read you, I didn't bring it to you, but I want to read you 2 other sources for Hanukkah. One of them is from the Talmud. But it's actually not, okay. Hold on, I'll find it for a moment. This one, sorry. Should be page 24. Moment. I didn't prepare this one, but here it is. Oh, it's 21. Hold on. 21. Yes, 21b. Okay, let's look it up. So, Shabbat 21b. It is. Okay, I'll show it to you now. Where are you? You're here. Okay. There's actually a long discussion here, but we'll see just a little bit of it. You see that? This is the Talmud Shabbat 21b. Now, before I explain what I'm reading, I want to tell you a little story. I mentioned you have the Mishnah in the oral tradition, and you have the Gemara, and the two of them together are called Talmud. The Mishnah is finished in the year 200. Now, the Mishnah has 6 categories, and it talks about Jewish law. It even has a book in the Mishnah called Megillah, which means the scroll, which is referring to the scroll of Esther and the festival of Purim, which is a post-biblical festival, meaning it's what we call a rabbinic festival. The interesting thing is, the Mishnah of Rabbi Judah, the president, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, does not talk about Hanukkah. He leaves it out completely. Hanukkah is only mentioned in the Mishnah as a time of the year. There's this time of the year called Hanukkah, but there's no description of what Hanukkah is in the Mishnah of Judah Nasi. The Talmud, in the tractate of Shabbat, when it's talking about lighting the candles for Shabbat, it also talks about lighting the candles of Hanukkah and gives Hanukkah 3 folio pages of discussion. But the Mishnah leaves it out. And the question is, why does the Mishnah leave it out? I think the answer is obvious. Judah Hanasi is writing under the Roman occupation. He's writing after the destruction of the temple, meaning after the Jews rebelled against the Romans in the year 70. He's also writing after the fall, after the Bar Kokhba revolt was put down by the Romans, which was 132 to 135. So the Jews had rebelled twice against the Roman Empire. If Judah Hanasi, in his Mishnah, would start now describing a festival called Hanukkah, where we successfully rebelled against the Seleucid Empire, who were right before the Romans, I don't think they would appreciate that so much. That's not a good thing to teach your children, the Romans would be saying. Because we're going to put it down again if you think that way. So he didn't think it was a good idea to talk about it, and he did not. The Talmud, though, meaning the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, which is being written in Babylonia under the Sassanid government, and the Sassanid government is a sort of a pagan government in Babylonia at the time, who were not very fond of the Romans. So they had and they weren't so crazy about the Greeks either. So they had no problem with Hanukkah. So, you want to rebel against those Greeks? Have a good time. Right? So they really had no problem with that. And therefore the Talmud has no problem talking about what Hanukkah was. It doesn't give it a whole book because it can't, because it's an expansion of the Mishnah. But it threw it in and that's where we're going to read here now. The Talmud talks about Hanukkah. Okay, that's right over here. So this is the Talmud, the tractate of Shabbat, laws of Shabbat, and they're going off on a tangent and talking about the candles that we light on Hanukkah. So here it is. The sages taught that the basic mitzvah of Hanukkah is to light a candle kindled by one person, the whole household, for the whole household. Those who are more strict and more meticulous light a candle for each person in the house. Those who are even more strict, they light a candle daily. How do you light it daily? According to Beit Shammai, on the first day you light 8, and then it descends. And according to the house of Hillel, first you light 1 candle, second day 2 candles, which is the way we do it today. The third day 3 candles, fourth day 4 candles, and by the 8th day you are lighting 8 candles. Now I'm going to jump. And the Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah? What is this festival of Hanukkah? Why do we light candles on it? The Gemara answers, the sages taught, quoting Megillat Ta'anit, which I mentioned to you before, the scroll of the days you're not supposed to fast on. But on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. You're not supposed to eulogize the deceased to make people more, in order not to make people too sad on those days. You're not supposed to fast, to have a post on those days. What is the reasons? When the Greeks, meaning the Seleucids, entered the sanctuary of the temple, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary. When the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious, they searched and found only one flask of oil that had the seal of the high priest. It was undisturbed by the pagan Greeks. And there was enough oil to light the menorah, the candelabra, for only one day. A miracle occurred and they lit it for 8 days. Next year, they instituted that these would be a holiday of Hanukkah. They would say the prayer of thanksgiving, which is called Hallel, and another prayer of thanksgiving within the prayers, etc. That's it. That's the quote from the scroll of Anit. So it appears then, according to the Gemara, all of a sudden Hanukkah, the main part of Hanukkah seems to be this miracle of the oil flask. But if you look very carefully at the quote, it says two things. It says when the Greeks came in and defiled the sanctuary of the temple, then the Hasmoneans beat the Greeks, and then they purified the temple and lit the candle, but the candle, there was only enough oil for one day and it burned for 8 days, which was the miracle. But they actually do mention two things. They mentioned that they regained sovereignty, right, by kicking the Greeks out, and that there was also this, and that they had rededicated the temple, and then the miracle of the oil flask. So if you read very carefully, you see three things there. Number one, they were able to kick out the Greeks and get back their sovereignty. Number two, they rededicated the temple. And number three, there was a miracle of the oil flask. When you look back, if you can remember, in the book of Maccabees, it didn't talk about a miracle of an oil flask. It does say that they relit the candelabra, what they call the candlesticks. It's not sticks, it was oil. It also says this in Flavius, also says they rekindled the candelabra, and he said they actually called it the Festival of Lights. So it is possible that already in the first century, Jews were lighting lights on Hanukkah, and that's why they called it the Festival of Lights. The only question is why? Why were they lighting the lights? Were they lighting the lights because there was a miracle of an oil flask? Or were they lighting the lights because that's the best way to represent the temple by mimicking the candelabra? Because you can't mimic the offerings. You can't bring an offering at home. So the only thing you can mimic is the candelabra. You can light a candle. Now, when we light a candle, you have 8, and then the one that you light from. So these represent the 8 days of Hanukkah, and the one in the middle is where you light from. Now, this represents the 8 days of Hanukkah, but it's actually a little bit like the candelabra in the temple. The difference is that the candelabra in the temple only had 7, right? That's the way the candelabra looked in the temple, was 7. Now, we're not supposed to make temple vessels outside the temple. So that's why it was very handy that Hanukkah was actually 8 days, so that it wouldn't be an exact replica of the candelabra from the temple, because you're not supposed to use vessels of the temple outside the temple. So that could be another reason why they wanted to light 8 and not 7, so that would not look like the candelabra of the temple. So, okay. Now, again, the question here is, what's this? I don't know. I see. So again, the question is, why all of a sudden does the scroll of Ta'anit start talking about this miracle of the oil flask. And why does the Gemara, the Talmud, quote that specifically? It's very possible that the Talmud was aware, might have been aware of the book of Maccabees. Not sure 100%. They probably heard about Flavius, but they probably didn't take him so seriously. But they also knew that, let me show you something else. Another thing. On Chanukah, which is called Al Hanisim, for the miracles. It goes like this. For the miracles and the wonders and the mighty deeds and the salvations and the victories that you brought for our ancestors in those days, in their time in these days. And then it describes what happened. In the days of Matityahu, son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the evil kingdom of Greece stood against your people Israel, it means the Seleucids, in order to make them forget your Torah and violate your laws. Because according to the book of Maccabees, by the way, Maccabees 1, not only did they try to Hellenize the Jews, they also tried to force them not to abide by the dietary laws, that they forced them to eat pork, didn't allow them to keep the Sabbath. There's a whole bunch of list there, which happened during the time of Antiochus. But I'll continue. And to violate your laws. You, in your enormous mercy, stood up for them in their time and their need. You upheld their cause. You judged their case. You avenged them from their oppressors. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak. By the way, weak is with an A. I don't know who did this. And many into the hands of a few. The impure into the hands of the pure, and the wicked in the hands of the righteous, the degenerates in the hands of those who cling to your Torah. You made for yourself a great and holy name and performed a great salvation and miracle for the people of Israel. And afterwards, your children came to the Holy of Holies in your temple. No, that's another mistake. It's the middle, it's the Heichal, it's the oracle of the temple. This is a bad translation, but you'll get the point. And they cleansed the palace and purified your temple and rekindled the lights in the courtyard, your sanctuary, and established these days of Hanukkah. Give thanks and praise to your holy name. So look at the last one. Afterwards, your children came to your house, meaning the temple, cleansed the temple, purified it, kindled the lights in the courtyard, and established the 8 days of Hanukkah. So this little prayer, which we recite on Hanukkah during the prayer service, also doesn't mention that there was any miracle of an oil flask. So we have 4 sources from the Hanukkah story. 3 of them do not mention the miracle of the oil flask, and 1 does. Now, but they all mention that the candelabra was lit in the temple. And Flavius even calls it the holiday of lights. So it's probably true that people lit candles at least as early as the 1st century, maybe even before that. So the question then is, why all of a sudden the flask, this miracle of the oil flask becomes so important? Again, what is the miracle of the oil flask? The story is that they're walking into the temple, they're looking to rekindle the candelabra. They look for oil, which was not used by the Greeks for paganism, and they find only 1 little flask, which is enough for 1 day, and it takes them 8 days in order for them to bring oil from the Galilee, from the olive presses there, and for some reason this oil continues for 8 days. By the way, in the 16th century, Joseph Caro, in his book Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, he says, if that's the reason for Hanukkah, then Hanukkah should be only 7 days, because you said they had enough oil for 1 day, and the miracle was it burnt another 7. So then Hanukkah should be 7 days then, and not 8, if that's the main reason. So he says, well, maybe it's 7 days for the oil flask and 1 day for the victory over the Seleucids. He gives a few possibilities. He gives another possibility that maybe since they knew it was only for 1 day, so every day they put in 1/8, and that 1/8 burned for the whole day. Okay, I'll tell you what I think. In general, in our tradition, we don't keep festivals because of miracles. We keep festivals because of something that happened historically. The Purim holiday, for instance, is celebrated because Haman wanted to kill the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. And God saved us through the doings of mortals, where Esther and Mordechai were able to outsmart Haman in the palace of Achashverosh at Artaxerxes, and the decree was abolished. That's a reason to have a holiday. And Hanukkah too. Not only did they defile, take away our sovereignty and defile the temple, but in the battle against, if we would have lost that battle, many tens of thousands of people would have been killed. So by solving the other way and saving the community and getting back the sovereignty, that's a reason to have a festival. The fact that candelabra burned for 8 days, didn't burn for 8 days, that's really insignificant from the point of view of Jewish law. That's not reason to have a festival. And I'll give you an example why. If you look in the book of Kings, Kings 1, towards the end, there's a story where a woman comes over to Elisha, the prophet, the student of Elijah. And she says to him, my husband died, but he was one of the Bnei HaNevi'im, those who wanted to be a prophet. And he was a righteous man. And now I have no money, and the creditors are coming to the house. And if I have no money, they're going to take away everything. And I won't have even way to feed my child. So Elisha says to her, well, what do you have in the house? She says, all I have is 1 jar of oil. That's it. And he says to her, okay, ask all your neighbors for vessels. So she asks all her neighbors for vessels, and her sons brings them into the kitchen. And Elisha says, just keep pouring until they all finish. And she pours from that 1 flask, and she fills up every vessel with olive oil until the whole house is full of these vessels of olive oil. And then she says to her son, is there another vessel? He says, no. And then it stops pouring. And then Elisha says to her, now take the olive oil, sell it off, and with that money, pay your creditors, and whatever's left, you'll buy food for yourself and for your son. That's the story. It's a miracle of an olive oil flask, but there is no holiday. So I'm just showing you that the fact that in the Bible you have a miracle of olive oil, that's not a reason for a festival. It's a great miracle. It's a great story, but that's not a reason for a festival. So the very fact that the olive oil burned for 8 days in the Hanukkah story, that would not be a real reason to have a holiday. The reason was we gained back sovereignty. We rededicated the temple, and a lot of lives were saved because it could have gone the other way. That's a reason for a festival. So why then, for the Talmud, is it so important to tell that story of the oil flask? I'll tell you something else. There was a critical edition of the Scroll of Ta'anit, which is quoted in the Talmud. I told you that book from the Second Temple period, which talks about all the civil holidays of the Second Temple period. It was put out in Tel Aviv University by Dr. Vered Noam. And she shows that there are 3 different versions of Megillat Ta'anit. There are 3 versions also for the Hanukkah story in Megillat Ta'anit. According to 2 of the versions, the reason why Hanukkah is 8 days, because it took 8 days to dedicate the altar, to fix the altar, which is exactly what it says in Maccabees 1. Only in 1 of the 3 does it mention the story of the oil flask. It's only 1 of the 3 versions. That's the one that the Talmud decided to pick, the one with the oil flask. Why? So assuming that the Talmud might have known that there were other versions to this book, Why did they pick that version? I'll tell you what I think. Whenever you have a battle, there are always going to be miraculous stories. We have that in Israel with the 6-Day War, with the 73 War, with the Lebanon operation. When you hear some of the stories of the soldiers coming back from the front and things that happen, a lot of miraculous stories. But you don't do a festival because of miraculous stories. Miraculous stories, make people enthusiastic. It gives a lot of meaning to the battles, but they remain as stories. And that's probably when the battle happened, the Hasmoneans taking over Jerusalem. This story was probably a very popular story about an oil flask that lasted for 8 days. But just like every story, it becomes a legend, a national legend of the people, but it's not a reason to have a holiday. It's an addition. Obviously, if you lived during that dedication of the temple, when the Hasmoneans were able to bring the Seleucid Empire to its knees and get back Jewish sovereignty, that was shocking for everybody who lived in Judea. I'm sure it was absolutely shocking. The legend of the oil flask was cute, but it wasn't shocking, if you understand what I'm saying. I have 10 minutes, so let me do this quickly. Now, let me explain to you then why for the Talmud it's so important to mention that the oil flask legend. When is the Talmud writing about Hanukkah? In Babylonia, under the Sassanid government. It's writing about Hanukkah in the 3rd century. After the destruction of the temple, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, now that the Jews are going to Babylonia because they've given up hope of getting back Jerusalem. So now that we don't have Jewish sovereignty in Judea, and we don't have a temple, and most of the Jews are living in Babylonia, how are you going to have a festival called Hanukkah, which is celebrating Jewish sovereignty in the Second Temple period? You realize the problem? The Talmud is looking to give new meaning to the Hanukkah festival. And what it discovers is there are 2 sides to Hanukkah. Yes, there is the rededication of the temple. Yes, there's the regaining of Jewish sovereignty from the Seleucid Empire. But in addition, there's also the battle, as mentioned by Josephus, for Jewish freedom of religion, for Jews to keep their religion despite being in the exile in Babylonia. And this is what we have to use as something significant now for the Jews of Babylonia. Because for the Jews in Babylonia, what they need to hear now is they need to be proud of their Jewish customs, even though they're in Babylonia in exile. They know that the Hasmoneans also rededicated the temple, but that's not going to happen at the moment. They know that the Hasmoneans regained sovereignty. That's not going to happen right now. So what you have to put the emphasis now is something which will be relevant to the Jews living in Babylonia, and that's called the miracle of the oil flask. The menorah represents the spirit, the light, right? The spirit that Judaism is trying to teach the Jewish people, even though they're in a foreign culture in Babylonia. And that's what now Hanukkah will represent. The triumph of spirit and culture, even when you're in an alien area, in a culture which is not your own, to be able to stand up, even when you're in a culture which is not your own. So what they did really, they shifted the emphasis in order to give Hanukkah new meaning for Jews in exile. And that's why today, people who've read the story of Hanukkah from the Talmud, they keep talking about the miracle of the oil flask. Because it's a way of keeping the same holiday, but imbuing it with new meaning. And that's exactly what happened to Hanukkah, which in a sense is the genius of the Talmud. Because it knows sometimes how to emphasize something else when necessary. Now that we've come back to the sovereign state of Israel, the original story becomes more meaningful. Because now we can look back and say, hey, we're the new Hasmoneans. You know? And Cyrus is like Balfour. So, that becomes a new imbued meaning to the holiday. That's what I wanted to say. That's basically it. So we got it within the last 10 minutes. Right? It's probably okay, everybody.